Hey, good afternoon, and welcome back to the last episode of the season of the Lunch and Learn for the academic year 2017-18. And we've got with us today a great guest to wrap up the season. We have Dr. Johnny Brennan, who is the Associate Dean for Innovation and Curriculum from ASDOH, the Arizona School of Dental and Oral Health. And we'll be talking a little bit about digital dentistry. So a good topic for today. Hopefully you're joining us either live on live stream or through Facebook, either way, and we'll give you some quick URLs at the bottom of your screen. So Facebook is its.atsu.edu/FB for Facebook. That'll get you live. And then also live, we stream on live.atsu.edu. And after the fact, if you want to pick up the entire season, or previous seasons, catch us at its.atsu.edu/YT for YouTube. So let's jump into it and talk a little bit about digital dentistry today. So Dr. Brennan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Brian.
I think the natural place to start is to kind of do a little bit of a definition. What is digital dentistry?
Well, I think a lot of people would want to just kind of lump in anything and everything electronic almost in dentistry under that big topic. But what it's become known as in the industry is really those technologies that have advanced and we see coming out in the CAD/CAM arena of dentistry. So a lot of stuff that we can talk about in more detail today, but where we can actually take a scan or an image of a patient's mouth, their tooth or teeth, and based on that imaging, sometimes even merge it with different modalities to come up with either, be it a crown, a bridge, a final restoration that comes out, or sometimes it's just the guide that helps us more accurately place implants or whatever surgically we're trying to achieve.
So you talk about CAD/CAM, which I believe is computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing, which I think is kind of from the manufacturing world, using computers to help build things in virtual space before they're created in physical space. And that's what we're seeing happening in dentistry?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially as our material science has progressed, we've seen even in the dental world, in terms of non-digital dentistry, we've seen just these huge advancements of material science that allow us to do things that are both very aesthetically pleasing, last the test of time, and then of course, the thing we always have to consider in dentistry is it has to not be poisonous in the mouth
Sure.
for us to be able to put it in and work with it. So over time, we've really seen that advance, and as that has advanced, alongside some of these digital techniques, it's opening up awesome whole new worlds of information that allow us to produce restorations that are just orders of magnitude better than in years past.
Sure. And I know these things don't just happen overnight. Kind of how old is this kind of technology in use, and what's happened recently as kind of the speed of things, the rate of change has increased?
So one of the pioneers in digital dentistry comes from a company named Sirona that actually went through an acquisition very recently with one of the behemoths in dentistry that was more on the supply end. So they're now called Dentsply Sirona. They celebrated a few years back one of their conferences for their 30th anniversary. So speaking historically, this isn't an overnight revolution. And I think you're hitting on a really key point. But like most technological advances, those early adopters and those early prototypes and machines are almost a world of difference from what we see and what we get to use today.
Sure.
A lot of the advancement that we're seeing most recently comes in terms of even the manufacturing part of the CAD/CAM model. So as we watch and hear in other industries about this idea of 3D printing and how that's having a major impact across multiple sectors in dentistry, we're seeing too new opportunities for that to impact our CAD/CAM or digital dentistry outcomes.
Sure. And so why is this important for ASDOH students to learn this kind of technology and some of these techniques?
So sadly, sometimes when we talk about private practice versus what we see in the dental school arena or in academics, we actually see that lag behind more often than not. And really, I would hope for, we should hope for it to be the opposite, that in the academic arena, we're through scholarship and other measures trying to lead the way and be very innovative. But this is an area where, in a lot of ways, private practice was the one to step out in front because of the cost of development and research to employ a lot of these digital dentistry techniques. And so it's critical for us in our program to prepare our students for the real world that they're going to experience. And more often than not, a lot of these private practitioners, wherever it is, whether it's literally a private practice or a community health center or some of these other areas, as digital dentistry is kind of taking that dental world by storm, we want our students upon graduation to be able to employ these techniques.
Great. So it's kind of the partnership between, let's call it industry or practice, and the education or academic side. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so as you think about integrating these techniques into the curriculum, I mean, that can't be a very straightforward thing. I mean, how do you go about, what are some of the implications of it? What's the timing of it? You know, I'm assuming that there's equipment and other things that are needed. How do you go about identifying that? How do you develop the faculty expertise? How does it work?
So, yeah, this is certainly an area where you can see a lot of programs stumble, and there's no silver bullet. There's no one word response or easy answer. And so at ASDOH, we've seen a lot of things work. We've seen a lot of things not work or fail, and learned from those failures or troubles that we've come up against. And so chief among them, as we looked at the curriculum at ASDOH, we really see students kind of progress over our 4-year curriculum from being very focused on the classroom and their initial introduction into dentistry being very basic science oriented, not unlike a medical or most health professions, the way the curriculum's structured, where they have to learn some foundational knowledge. And then very quickly, we have the challenge of our graduates have to graduate with a skill that they can license and go into practice within that 4 years. We don't have necessarily a required postdoc training after they get their degree. So based on that, they very quickly go from that foundational knowledge into some pre-clinic or simulation clinic exercises where they're learning some techniques in the classroom, and that very same day they walk across the street or even within the simulation lab, and they have to put that into practice with their hands. And that's half of the challenge of dental school. And then, of course, that needs to translate quickly as well to actually working on patients instead of a plastic dummy or plastic teeth, to be able to apply that knowledge in a clinical setting. And so I lay all of that out because one of the important things we have to consider when looking at digital dentistry is how does that embed into the curriculum, as you were asking, and does it really deserve its own specialty or its own niche? Or more often, as we're seeing, actually, digital dentistry has a niche or a foothold in a lot of the existing specialties within dentistry. So, long-winded way to say, one of the first things we did to approach it, rather than just approach students in that 3rd or 4th year when they're very clinically focused and lose opportunity ahead of time, we decided we need to introduce this very early in the curriculum to the students, so that when they're going through their simulation exercises and learning what is a crown and how do I prepare a tooth for a crown, that we can actually teach them in the simulation period how to scan that tooth and how to do the digital design and some of those components, so that when they get to clinic, they're much better off than they were had we just introduced it clinically.
Great. Great. And so talk to me a little bit about what some of the necessary skills are for students to be able to do digital dentistry. It seems to me like there's a part that's purely technical, you know, maybe some computer training or other things that they need to do. Some that's conceptual, you know, how to conceptualize things on a computer screen in 3 dimensions. And even some artistic components, you know, if you're talking about shaping and whatnot, the different crowns.
Well, I guess I would start by saying one of the beauties of digital dentistry, one of the things that you just cannot escape, and this is why those that are very passionate about dentistry tend to eventually embrace the digital movement and find that it has major value is you can't get away from the foundational skills, the foundational knowledge of dentistry being the most important part. Just learning how to use the computer, how to design on the computer, and forgetting some of the core curriculum would result in a restoration or whatever your end game is with the digital dentistry that doesn't really fit what you need.
Sure.
And so what I'm driving at is this is perfect for an educational setting because it reinforces the very skills that we're promoting and does so in a very objective way. It does it right in front of the student. So as they're learning about what is important in a tooth preparation, they get to scan that very thing that they just built with their hands, put it on a screen 3-dimensionally, and magnify it up to 40 times so that they can kind of spin it around and visually get to see these concepts that we were 2-dimensionally or verbally trying to express. So I don't know if I got too far away from your question, pontificating a little bit, but one of the necessary skill sets, I guess my first answer is, it's actually dentistry itself. And this technology used in the education setting is one of the best things we have to reinforce those very dental skills. That's the core of what we're trying to do.
Great, yeah. So kind of as this technology evolves and it becomes embedded in the curriculum, where do you think digital dentistry is headed, and how do you see these skills being applied kind of moving into the future?
So that's a great question. I think stepping back for a moment and talking about how technology in general gets adopted, and you have these really early adopters kind of bleeding edge, so to speak, and then you get this nice bell curve where you find this middle ground. I think digital dentistry today is no longer something that most people would refer to as early adopters. Most are in that middle bell curve stage, and we're seeing a lot of private practitioners that had peaked interest but were maybe not in that category technologically where it's very easy, that they're now starting to adopt these same pieces of technology or approaches to dentistry. And so one of the things we see is an explosion of vendors, devices, software around digital dentistry. Whereas in the past, it was so expensive and we only had a couple to choose from, we're now starting to see a movement not unlike we see in other industries with technology, even the consumer region, where we've got a series of items that claim to be open source or open in their nature. And then you've got a whole other array that take more of an Apple philosophy, that they scale the solutions A to Z, and by doing so, make it a little bit more user friendly, have a really solid support system, et cetera. So what I'm getting after is one of the immediate next stages or future outlooks for digital dentistry is a wider adoption with a lot more options to choose from.
Great. So you've kind of explained how the ecosystem around digital dentistry is expanding as part of this effort. What do you see as the broader implications for education itself by using these techniques?
So one of the first things that any dentist, and this is outside of dental school, any dentist that decides or goes after trying to employ digital dentistry, and I can speak from personal experience on this front, that the deeper I got into using this in clinical practice, the more I realized this is one of the best feedback mechanisms I have as a practitioner. That what I thought was good hand skills and I was doing the right things, once I got the immediate feedback of having a 3-dimensional rendering of my work and being able to critique that on a screen, I was very quickly finding, I was not giving enough space for the porcelain or the restoration that the lab was going to make, or what I thought was a really smooth outline actually was very rough when you blow it up 40 times. So it helped me immediately become a better dentist. And I think taking that concept and saying with these brand new pre-dentist students that we have, trying to give them those tools immediately so that they start learning how to self-evaluate and they start getting that feedback in an objective way rather than questioning their professor or an opinion, that they get to just see, there's no lying. This is what I did with my hands. that sets up for a lifelong learner, and that's what we're really targeting.
Sure. So the use of data as a feedback mechanism and then shortening those feedback loops so that they get that more instantaneous feedback. I think that I agree. That'll have a big implication for education.
Absolutely. And one of the solutions we implement from Dentsply Sirona, one of our vendors, in the simulation clinic, they actually have designed a program that takes the very, very similar design system that you use clinically or chairside with your patient. They actually took that system and built in educational things. It's called Prep Check. So we have all of our students, when they prep their first crowns and they scan it, it actually highlights for them with different colors around the preparation or metrics and reporting. It gives them an immediate objective feedback based on measurements of what the tooth looked like before versus what it looks like now. Or we can even compare it to what the instructor prepared, and they can kind of look at how does mine match up against the instructor.
Excellent. Well, I want to dig into the vendors and kind of some of their particular niches and some of the equipment that's used in a bit. But let's first go to a break. If we can, take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll go to part two, where we'll get into more of the details, and we'll talk to Johnny about what some of the challenges are that they've encountered in going to digital dentistry. So before we go to the break, if you have any questions, make sure that you put them into Facebook or the chat. We'll have people reading those, and we'll get them to Dr. Brennan so that he can respond to them. And let's go to the break, where I think we're going to hear a little bit about ATSU, and Harvey Summers.
Actually Kenneth Harvey Summers, though I go by Harvey Summers, and my department is University Advancement, and my title is Gift Income Coordinator. I'm on the Missouri campus. I have been with ATSU since 2003, so August will be 15 years. Describing my job to a child: I'm the person that takes all the money that comes into the university and makes sure that it gets to the funds that the donor wants it to get to.
What would your autobiography be titled?
He did what? Oh, my favorite cookie. My favorite cookie would probably be chocolate chip. What song should be playing when I walk into the room? You know, I really don't have a good idea on this one, though. What they play when the president walks in would be a good one. If I could go back in time, what would I tell my teenage self? I think I would tell my teenage self, don't worry about it, do whatever you can within reason, and don't worry about what others think.
Who would play you in a movie about your life?
Nicolas Cage. What superpower would I like to have? Flight would be fun.
Pepsi or Coke?
Coke.
Texting or talking?
Talking.
Favorite day of the week?
Friday.
Cake or pie?
Pie.
Star Wars or Star Trek?
Both.
Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
Book or Kindle?
Book.
Mac or Windows?
Windows.
Royals or Cardinals?
That's not even a tough question. Royals.
All right, great. Thanks, Harvey. And hopefully that helps people get to know ATSU. And if I'm not mistaken, a little birdie told me that I think the Cardinals and the Royals are playing tonight. So good game. Before we go back with Dr. Brennan and talk about some of the vendors and equipment needs, there was a question that came in that I think is a good one. which is, what's the role of kind of FDA approval? Has it been approved for restorations or different types of procedures? And kind of what is that role?
Perfect. That's a great question. And I think where I would start with answering that is fundamentally around the materials that we use. So one of the most popular CAD/CAM materials when we're fabricating crowns or even bridges is something we call Emacs. That's a lithium disilicate material. And whether that's done through a milling unit based on digital process or more in the analog world, what we used to do with taking impressions and sending to the lab for them to press, it's a same or similar material because it's based out of that material science to make that lithium disilicate. So that's one of the primaries that we use, and then there's several others variations, and this is one of those holy grail quests that a lot of the manufacturers want to find that edge up on the competition, slightly changed material, and then push that, because as much as this equipment can be very expensive, the year-over-year cost in blocks and profit margin that can be made on the materials used is another huge revenue source for these companies.
Sure.
So that's one area. And then I suppose the other that you can walk down is, like, for example, in the implant arena, we can restore those with parts and pieces that integrate into each implant, and each manufacturer has their own design to that implant. So this is an area where they have to get FDA approval for those restorations that sit on each implant.
Sure. So I'm sure the materials are important. And I know, as you and I have talked in the past, as the sensors become smaller, there's also opportunities for sensors to go into some of these crowns and whatnot. And I assume that, there's some type of approval that needs to go into that process as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Well, before we dig right into vendors, if you would, Dr. Brennan, kind of give us an overview of what the process or the workflow is. So it seems like there's some equipment that you would need for kind of the acquisition of the image, some equipment that you would need then to do the digital manipulation and kind of design work, and then maybe a third type of equipment for creating the physical product. Can you walk us through that whole process and what the workflow is?
Well, I think you've done your research, Brian, for sure, because I know you're not a dentist, but you just nailed kind of how we would approach it with a beginning student or a first timer, so to speak, that really we view it almost in 3 stages. And anybody that wants to begin walking down digital dentistry but may have some intrepidation about the technology, that's the other way that I would help break it up is in 3 parts. That we really need to be able to first acquire imaging. We call that the digital impression. So all of you out there that have been to the dentist and had that gooey material put in, that impression material, instead of doing it that way, in the digital world, a lot of times we can take a scan of the tooth using intraoral scanners. We still may take that impression, but put that impression in a machine that then digitally scans the impression instead of directly scanning in the mouth. Just depends on why and various aspects around it. So that's step 1, is getting the imaging so we have that digital representation of what your mouth looks like. Step 2 is generally design around what we're trying to create. So we go through that modeling process on the computer. And then step 3, as you mentioned, the manufacturing step, it has a few different pathways available depending on what we're trying to produce. So that's where we see a lot of differentiation, a lot of systems coming to the market, a lot of marketing pitch around, well, we create a step 3 type product, a mill or ovens to bake the materials and make them harder or stronger, et cetera. And we integrate and work with the following software or following systems. And others that say, actually, no, we're pretty closed off, but we create it all from start to finish.
Sure. And so certainly some of this equipment is let's call it newer technology, the milling machines or the 3D printing. But I'm assuming that not all of it is new to dentistry. There have been X-rays, and the cone beam has been around for a while, so you can get kind of the whole skeletal view of someone's oral cavities, pun intended. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming that it's not all brand new. It's kind of integrating some of the existing technology with the newer stuff.
But that's a great example that you bring up. So for a while, like you mentioned, cone beam CTs, that we've had that in dentistry to be able to take with limited radiation, take a scan digitally of the skeletal structures and get a three-dimensional representation of that. Now that we have some of these other tools, one of the areas that we have just seen it explode at ASDOH for our use of digital dentistry is, so we take that skeletal 3D representation of a patient, then we take this scan, whether it's an intraoral scanner or one that sits on a desktop and we scan that impression. Either way, we take those two image sets and we put them together. So we've got that skeletal representation, then we have a really high definition representation of the patient's teeth or their mouth. And by putting those two scans together, now we can, on a computer, design surgical procedures, most commonly an implant, and we get to, ahead of time, say exactly where we want an implant to go. And there's a lot that goes into that, where, especially in an education setting, it's very, very eye-opening to the student to recognize ahead of time, oh, my patient has a nerve that comes through there, and as I'm putting the implant in, I'm being very aware and keeping track of where that nerve is. I don't want to damage or run into it. And it impacts the size and selection of my implant. It impacts the angulation of where I put the drill, et cetera. And so as they go through that process, fast forwarding through a lot of the details, and they get that, ultimately that product, in this case, it would be a surgical guide that's either milled or 3D printed. They then take that to the patient's mouth on the day of surgery, and we've had the student essentially virtually go through the surgery from A to Z before even sitting down with the patient that day, which is an incredible experience that they have already foreseen a lot of the obstacles that, rather than having to deal with it real time and kind of try to mentally visualize, they've had the benefit of all this imaging ahead of time to plan and think about and spend a lot of time preparing for surgery. And it makes that a very predictable outcome where they put the surgical guide in place and it essentially just takes the implant drill and puts it exactly where they planned.
Nice. So now you're starting to talk about some of my area, software. And there's a lot of software that's involved in this. And knowing the software industry, there are many vendors that come into play that have a little bit of a niche here or a little bit of a niche there, and sooner or later there's kind of some overlap between different vendors. Can you tell us a little bit about who the major vendors are, so that other people who are watching this and kind of thinking, if I were thinking about digital dentistry, who should I be going to talk to? And what are their areas of expertise per se?
Okay, sure. I've mentioned so far one of the 300-pound gorilla, or the huge company based on a recent merger is Dentsply Sirona, and they very much took the approach very Apple-esque, where they wanted to design a process or a system that tried to lower the barrier, the technological barrier to adopting these techniques, and by doing so, they kept their system rather closed for a long time, although they're seeing and feeling a lot of the industry pressures to need to open up at least parts of that system. So they're one of the key vendors, and in an education setting, and especially an eye towards that initial practice of dentistry and trying to lower those barriers as well, to keep that learning curve very low. They're a decent choice for us, and especially when it comes to single units like a single crown. They're one of the experiences that our students have quite repeatedly in our clinics, as well as the pre-clinic, because of the software that they developed for use in the simulation lab for students. Outside of them, there's another product made by a company called 3Shape. They make a scanner called the Trios, and we have one of those in our prosthodontic clinic. One of the huge advantages to that is, and now you're getting into opinion a little bit, but in my opinion, one of the best scanners, if not the best scanner on the market right now, because of its quality and resolution and ease of use.
Okay.
So we have that available to us, and they're one that is more that open framework where you can take that digital impression and then you can continue to use the 3Shape system for designing, or you can take that scan and bring it out in a standardized format. In this case, it's an STL, and you can put it into some other design software, whichever you're comfortable with.
And how much overlap is there, or how much kind of standard interfaces are there between these applications? Can you literally take a scan from one product and move it into another? Or obviously in my world, we see lots of limitations with that. Vendors will talk about it, but it doesn't always work as well with a second vendor's product as it does with the first vendor's.
I think you nailed it there, Brian. And that's one of the marketing pitches or ploys that is sometimes really difficult for a dentist to be able to, especially as this area is exploding, decipher what these things mean and which one is the best option or best choice for me as a practitioner. So what you said holds true with digital dentistry, that there is a standardized format, and it's actually not one unique to digital dentistry. That STL format is more of a three-dimensional representation of an object. So when you talk about 3D printing, having nothing to do with dentistry, you're usually working in the realm of STL files.
Sure.
.stl is the extension. So we can take from that 3-shape scanner, it's a great example, it's a color scan. In fact, it's so accurate that we can scan the tooth and we can actually shade match the patient's tooth digitally using the software based on what that scanner took in, the calibrated scanner. But once we convert it to an STL, it's more of a grayscale or a single dimension of coloring. So we lose that kind of wow factor for sure, and sometimes the contrast that goes with it. And then, of course, anything we had done as part of that scanning, as part of design, for example, one of the first things we do is we go in for a crown prep and we trace around the margin, the outside portion of the tooth, because that's where the interface is going to be designed for our crown. And as we do that in the 3-shape software, as soon as we export as an STL, we lose all that information, all of that data.
So I can see that there are a fair number of challenges in trying to put all of this together, from choosing vendors to figuring out, what components to put in the curriculum, even how many units you might need to have to get all of the students adequate time to be able to practice on it. What are some of the big obstacles that ASDOH has run into, and how did you handle them?
So ASDOH, I would credit ASDOH with starting this venture years before I even landed on the scene. And I'm actually an alumni from the programs. So I graduated fairly recently, 2012. And far before me, back in 2008, we got our first scanning units for digital dentistry. And Dr. Rizuki, in combination with our lab, worked to start that process. And along the way, some of the major obstacles we encountered was it was such a new concept that a lot of our faculty had never done this in practice. They came to the table with 20, 30 plus years of real patient experience, and they draw from that to teach our students concepts around dentistry. But then they just really struggled in terms of, well, this isn't something that I've had in my hands for 30 years. In fact, it hasn't even been around that long. So how am I supposed to feel confident showing a student how to use that? So that was one of the initial barriers that we've seen, and it continues to be one that we work around. But one of the very initial pushes and success we've seen is the more we can translate to the students having a certain skill set around the technology to be able to produce a scan and bring it in digitally, and then the instructors still relying on the core concepts of dentistry around what the impression needs to have, and working almost together as a team to manipulate the digital part of it, but getting back to that key skill set. The whole point of it all, to teach dentistry and to get that dental outcome, helps us overcome that.
Sure, I think that's where there's real beauty in education, is when the instructor and the student kind of tend to become one, and they're teaching and learning from one another. And it seems like, especially in areas like this where things are changing so rapidly, it's really not even fair to expect a faculty to know everything about what it is, because it's changing so quickly that it's just not practical. Yet they have that, years of practical experience, like you say, the core dentistry concepts that they can bring to the student and help them understand where it fits in the broader picture of things.
Right. And I by no means mean to say that we have it all figured out, and all of our faculty and all of our students do digital dentistry every hour of every day. But we've made huge strides, and I think one of the things that's really difficult across the board is sometimes we get this paralysis by analysis, or this fear that it's all or none. And so that's one of the other approaches we've taken is, well, where can we start? Let's at least start. And whether it's getting a faculty that's very comfortable to start leading the charge, or designating a couple chairs to be digital dentistry chairs, and then kind of going from there to build and expand. And we're in the process, and I think it'll be an ever evolving work that we do to continue to integrate these concepts into our curriculum, to have the students really adopt them, as well as our faculty.
That's great. Any other last minute advice that you would give to other programs who are thinking about building this into their curriculum?
So this is a little bit of a plug since you asked. One of our points of pride this past year, we participated in, there's American College of Prosthodontics is a group for prosthodontists. It's their organization. They created a program for digital dentistry to really push things forward, and they were very aggressive, and it's amazing what they've been able to produce. We were part of 5 schools that were selected. We were part of a pilot program this past year to give feedback, as well as learn and be able to kind of use that curriculum they were building that would be shared with any and all schools that want to use it. So that would now be the very first direction I would point people, is go after that curriculum, learn from the mistakes and learn from the lessons of others, and try to adopt those things first and those approaches first.
Excellent. Well, before we go, I want to go back to questions, because we've got, I think, a great question to end on, and it's a future orientation question, I think, and that is kind of, what are the artificial intelligence apps or applications that you can foresee or that exist in digital dentistry?
So this is an area that I love that this question was asked. The Google conference just a couple weeks ago, Google released access to their machine learning technology and capability. And up to that point, I had heard a lot about artificial intelligence, played around with a couple tools here or there, but it was really eye-opening for me to recognize that essentially they were giving the common person, small startups and any industry, access to the very same tools, these multi-million, if not billion-dollar resources that they could essentially rent and create new things. So I think whether it's artificial intelligence or where I would start more the machine learning for a lot of these imaging modalities, to a few things that come to mind to me are when we take x-rays and we're looking and searching with human eyes to find that decay, those things that look off, or pathology, or areas where we're really straining our eyes and trying to focus, to have machines start to learn what caries and decay looks like, what cancer looks like, and help highlight that for the practitioner. On the other end of the spectrum, as we're talking about these digital dentistry techniques with CAD/CAM operations, we've in a way seen artificial intelligence already in the product, because it takes hundreds of registries of people's teeth with the anatomical differences, and it blends those to the patient's mouth, and it creates a proposal, a model, when we're designing. And over the last 5 years alone, I've watched as that model gets more and more accurate and requires less and less human intervention to make it look like the tooth that we need it to look like. So I certainly see this as the future of it continues to be more and more, the suggestions are dead on for what we're looking for. That's
great. Dr. Brennan, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. Very interesting concept, very interesting curriculum. I think we've talked about this offline. It's the way of the future, and I'm glad that ATSU is a big part of it. So thank you.
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it.
Great. So we'll call that a wrap for our last episode of the 2017-2018 season. Again, you can go to the YouTube channel at its.atsu.edu to catch this episode and previous episodes, and we'd encourage you to do it. There's some good content on here. So thank you for watching. Thanks especially to the whole crew who put this together each week. I don't want to name names because I always forget someone, but if you get a minute, then let's look at the credits and watch. There is one name that I will add because I forget it every year, and that is Jean Varnel, our executive producer and director. She's great, and she's really taken this to a whole new level. So thank you, Jean, and thanks everyone else who works on it. Until the fall, when we'll see you for the next season. Thank you much.